Okay, I'll get started. So today's session is on the respiratory and circulatory systems. Sorry, respiratory. My name is Pranava, so if you guys haven't had any sessions with me before, I'll quickly introduce myself. I graduated this past May, and I'm applying the cycle, so if you guys have any questions about that, you can email me specifically, and I'll put my email in the chat. And then you can also just email us at the mcat101questions@gmail.com at any time. So just get right into it since we do have a lot to cover. The respiratory system is pretty low yield. You don't need to know it in depth, at least not as much as you need to know the circulatory system. So here's a quick overview. The lungs, the primary organ of the respiratory system is located in the thoracic cavity, and a cavity is just like a hollow space in the body. So underneath the thoracic cavity is the abdominal cavity. So the thoracic cavity also contains the heart and other major blood vessels of the circulatory system. Other than the lungs, other important structures of the respiratory system are the nose, mouth, pharynx, larynx, epiglottis, vocal cords, trachea, bronchi, lungs, alveoli, and diaphragm. You don't need to know much in depth about this, probably be able to recognize them or recognize that they're part of the respiratory system if you see them come up. And then the most important thing to know about the respiratory system is basically how the mechanism of breathing works. So breathing is not a passive process. It occurs because the diaphragm is a skeletal muscle that kind of wraps around snugly under the lungs. So it's a skeletal muscle, and what it does when it contracts is that it generates negative pressure for expanding the lungs. And I'll go into this more in the coming slides. So while diaphragm is a skeletal muscle, and you guys should know that skeletal muscles are under somatic or voluntary control, breathing overall is under autonomic control. And then I just wanted to clarify the difference between these two terms before we proceeded. So ventilation and respiration are used in similar contexts, so you might get them confused, but they are different things. So ventilation is just the actual movement of breathing. So it's moving air into and out of the lungs. On the other hand, respiration is the actual goal of this organ system, and that's gas exchange, particularly oxygen and carbon dioxide. And then something else to know about the lung anatomy before we move on is that there's these pleural membranes that surround the lungs. And what this forms is like a closed seal around the lungs against which it can expand. So this is the outer pleural membrane, and this is the inner pleural membrane, and between them is the interpleural space. And in this interpleural space is a thin layer of liquid to lubricate the surfaces. Otherwise, there'd be these two separate pleural membranes that would be rubbing against each other and creating friction, which is not favorable. That's about the extent of the depth you need to know about these. So to go into more depth about the breathing mechanism, here's a diagram that I'll show you briefly. So when you inhale air, this diaphragm, which I was talking about earlier, contracts. So that means it moves down. And what this does is creates additional volume in the thoracic cavity that wasn't there before. And if you guys remember the gas laws from general chemistry, if volume increases, pressure decreases. So in the chest cavity and then also in the lungs, you have pressure that is lower than the pressure of the outside air. As a result, air moves in to the lungs. And then another thing to remember about inhalation is that There's also intercostal muscles that contract, so the diaphragm and those muscles kind of work together to expand that rib cage, to create that negative pressure that directs air to come into the lungs. On the other hand, exhalation is the exact opposite of that pattern. The diaphragm relaxes, which means it moves back up to its original position. The volume of the chest cavity and the lungs again drops, which means the pressure increases. Um, and then the pressure inside the lungs at that point exceeds the pressure outside of the lungs, and then air will be exhaled until those pressure inside the lung and outside the lung match. Couple, pretty much the slide says what I just tried to go over, but so it's an active process because the diaphragm needs to contract for inhalation to actually occur. You have the diaphragm and intercostal muscles. Diaphragm flattens, which is the same thing as contracting. Chest wall expands, volume increases, pressure decreases. And then this is an important point. While you should know that the pressure in the lungs decreases, what's important is that it decreases to the point that it's lower than atmospheric pressure. And then that's the same thing for the lungs. So we kind of, you kind of don't need to know in depth about like differentiating between pressure in the interpleural space versus the lungs. But this is an additional level of detail they had in the Kaplan book, so I included that here. Just know that inhalation is caused by the fact that there's lower pressure inside the lungs than it is in the atmosphere. So this phenomenon is called negative pressure breathing. And what that negative pressure refers to is just that the driving force of that first step of inhalation is that you have relatively negative pressure in the lungs compared to the outside world. And then on the other hand, exhalation is a passive process. The diaphragm relaxes. Sorry, that should not be contracts. I'll fix that. Relaxes, so it moves back up. And then the other intercostal muscles also relax. Chest cavity decreases in volume. Pressure increases back up. And then air is pushed out of the lungs until the pressure inside the lungs matches the pressure of the atmosphere. An important point to note about this is that the alveoli, which are kind of the smallest unit of breathing, at the end of they're basically the sites of a gas exchange. So they're these elastic structures. And why they don't collapse during exhalation is because they have surfactant on them that reduces the surface tension so that they don't collapse. And I have a question here. Sorry. And you guys can actually just put your answer choice in the chat. And then now's the time you can also ask questions if you have questions on anything else we covered so far. Okay, I'm seeing A's, so that is correct. So just to go through the other answer choices, first to address this actual question, the diaphragm does contract, so it moves down and increases the volume of the lungs and the thoracic cavity, and that causes this negative pressure. So this is active because the diaphragm has to contract to start off that process. And then to the other muscles, the intercostal muscles are involved, but they're not the actual force that drives it. They kind of just aid the diaphragm. And then on the other hand, the passive process is exhalation. So In exhalation, the diaphragm relaxes, so it moves back up. And the elastic force that option C is referring to is this recoil force of the thoracic cavity and also of the alveoli that produce a positive pressure in the lungs relative to the atmosphere. So because that positive pressure is greater than the atmospheric air pressure, the air is forced outward during exhalation. The use of the intercostal muscles are they active or passive? So they're kind of I don't think you really need to know them in those terms. They kind of aid the other muscles. I think they're involuntary, so I'm not sure you need to know them in those terms. Sorry, I don't know how to answer that, but I think you don't need to worry about it. And does anyone have any other questions before we move on? I think there's another question, and if you have any questions at any point, just put it into the chat. So this question asks, what is the pressure of gas within the alveoli at the peak of inspiration, right before expiration, relative to that of atmospheric air? Okay, so got a mix of answers, mostly B and D. And yeah, this was a bit confusing, so I'll take you through the explanation. So the answer is actually D. And the key is that it refers to inspiration at the peak. So this is a bit tricky because what happens at the peak of inspiration or expiration, which is the thing that I have in bold right here, is that airflow basically stops. And why it stops is because the pressure inside the lungs is approximately equal to that of the atmosphere. So once that like pressure differential is gone away at your peak of either inspiration or expiration, then airflow stops. The pressure at the alveoli would be less than the pressure of the atmosphere during all other periods of inspiration, but not at its peak. And then pressure in the alveoli would be greater than the atmospheric pressure during exhalation. So anytime that the pressure is greater in the alveoli, you're going to expire air until the pressure equals that of the atmosphere. Okay. So moving on to different topics. So there's kind of like different types of lung volumes and capacities that may show up. So I wanted to briefly cover this. So the total lung capacity is the complete volume of air the maximum volume of air that your lung can carry. Tidal volume is your average volume of air that you inhale or exhale in an average breath. Your expiratory reserve volume is the volume of air that you can push out extra if you forcibly exhale. So after you take a normal breath and you exhale, you can exhale some more, and that's your expiratory reserve volume. Similarly, your inspiratory reserve volume is when after taking a normal breath in, you can breathe in some extra air, and that's your inspiratory reserve volume. And your vital capacity is basically, sorry, let me move on to the next slide. It's just the difference between the maximum volume of air in your lungs minus the minimum volume of air in your lungs. So this residual volume then is the minimum amount of volume, the minimum volume of air that will be in your lungs at all times. So you cannot expire any more air past this dotted line. This amount of volume will always be, this volume of air will always be in your lungs. There's a question in the chat, do we need to memorize the vocabulary on this diagram? Not so much memorized, but I have seen a couple questions like this come up, so it'd just be good to know. It's not as complicated as you think, and once you break down the terminology, it would be pretty easy to remember, but I recommend knowing them. And this is just a chart that I put in, so you guys can take a look at this later. It says most of the same things that I just said. And then to move on, what are the mechanisms that regulate breathing? So ventilation, same thing as breathing, is regulated by these neurons called ventilation-centered neurons. And neurons operate by electrical activity. So their activity determines the regular contraction of these respiratory muscles. So these neurons contain both chemoreceptors. They contain chemoreceptors which respond to changes in CO2 concentration. So if carbon dioxide partial pressure in the blood increases, then respiratory rate increases to exhale more air, therefore exhaling more carbon dioxide. And these chemoreceptors also respond to oxygen concentration to some extent, but this is only in the cases of extremely low concentrations. And then earlier I mentioned that breathing is largely an autonomic process, so somatic control of breathing is possible to a small extent, like you can force faster or slower breathing, but extended periods of hypoventilation, so low volumes of breathing, would cause an override by the ventilation-centered control. So the primary function of the respiratory system is this gas exchange, and this is what I mentioned earlier. And this gas exchange occurs through simple diffusion across concentration gradients. So I'll go into this more a little bit later, but the pulmonary arteries are what bring deoxygenated blood to the lungs, and pulmonary veins take away oxygenated blood from the lungs to the heart. And why this is important is because the levels of oxygen in the blood is what determines the exchange of oxygen at the alveoli. So this pressure differences are the driving force for gas exchange. So when you're at, so to take a look at this diagram on the right, so when your pulmonary arteries bring in that deoxygenated blood and you're at your alveoli contain higher concentration of oxygen and lower concentration of CO2 than your deoxygenated blood. And this difference in concentration causes oxygen to enter your bloodstream and then CO2 to enter the alveoli to be exhaled. And then once this gas exchange occurs, your pulmonary veins take away this oxygenated blood back to the heart. And a couple other secondary functions of the respiratory system that you need to know on kind of just the surface level, but one is thermoregulation, so controlling body temperature, and this is just done by any circulatory system blood vessels, but to talk about the capillaries and the respiratory tract, so dilating them or constricting them would cause a change in the temperature. And then your respiratory system also creates mucus secretions, so evaporating water through those secretions is also a way of controlling temperature. Let me take a pause here to look at some of the questions in the chat. Joshua says, is a gas exchange caused by both pressure and concentration gradient differences? So these are basically the same thing. So oxygen concentration is just another way of measuring like partial pressure of oxygen. They're the same thing. I think it's like Henry's law or something in Gen Chem, but it relates like partial pressure to concentration. They're just different ways of measuring the same thing, which is the relative amount of the gas you have in your volume of blood. If that helps, can you just say you're good to go then? Or ask if it doesn't help. Okay, thanks. And then, yeah, I can go back to looking at tidal volume. So here, I'll start with the definition. So it's the volume of air inhaled or exhaled in each typical breath. So to go back to this chart, it's this relatively small amount of volume of air. So, and this is just because this is like when you're unconsciously, like you're not aware of your breathing. It's just the typical amount of air you breathe in a regular breath. And then this is also the same amount of air that you expire in a regular breath. So these expiratory or reserve volumes are things that you have to do consciously to kind of get rid of more air or to kind of inhale more air. But this is the tidal volume is the typical volume of air that you inhale or exhale. Yeah, okay. Yeah, the terms can be a little bit confusing. Do you need help with vital capacity too, or is that okay? Okay. And last question, dilating reduces temperature, correct? Yes. So I think there's a little bit more on that later, but constricting blood vessels increases temperature, dilating it reduces it.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, like, how does the constriction or the dilation of blood vessels actually, how does the respiratory system affect that?
So this is not specific to the respiratory system. Actually, it just is relevant to any blood vessels, but how that constriction or dilation regulates temperature is that when you dilate blood vessels, it essentially carries more blood to kind of like your peripheries. So it, and please correct me, it's been a while since I reviewed this and I should have brushed up on it, but dilating your blood vessels moves away the blood from your core organs and moves it to your peripheries. So it kind of carries away the temperature from your core. And then constriction does the opposite. So it reduces the amount of blood that's kind of traveling around. So you're able to conserve your temperature in your core. Is that okay?
Got it. Thank you.
And thank you guys for checking me on that. So another function of the respiratory system is some immune functions. So the nasal cavity, so just your nose, has like these tiny little hairs called vibrissae. And what these do is they trap like particulate matter that may contain like pathogens and also have enzymes called lysosomes to attack bacteria before they enter your respiratory tract. And then your respiratory tract also has mucus that can also do similar functions of trapping particulate matter. On the other hand, lungs have these immune cells called macrophages and mast cells that can that can take care of these pathogens if they do enter. And you can read more about these in the immune system chapter, and we also have a topic session on that coming up. Lastly, pH control is another function of the respiratory system, and a lot of these functions are really intertwined with the circulatory system. So thermal regulation and pH control are one of those examples. So the bicarbonate buffer system is what's referring to as how CO2 exists in our blood. So when blood becomes too acidic or basic, as I was referring to earlier, there's these chemoreceptors in the ventilation center neurons that can sense these changes. So you adjust the respiratory rate to kind of either breathe more rapidly to get rid of more carbon dioxide, or breathe less rapidly to have an adequate level of carbon dioxide. And more on the bicarbonate system later. So now we can move on to the cardiovascular system. So this is definitely a bit more higher yield. So we'll talk about this in more detail. So to go over the basic heart anatomy before we get into it. The heart is a series of two pumps rather than like one unified pump, which is what I think of, and you guys might also assume, but really there's your right side pump, which accepts deoxygenated blood from the body and moves it to the lungs to be oxygenated there, and how that happens is what we just talked about at the alveoli, and this is through those pressure differentials or concentration differentials of the gases. On the other hand, you have your left-hand side, and this is a pump that receives oxygenated blood from the lungs and then sends it out to the rest of the body. And within the right side and left side, each side has one atria and one ventricle, and these are structures that have different functions. So atria, these are thin-walled, so less muscular structures, and they contract to push blood into the ventricles. And ventricles are more muscular structures, and they need to have that force because they're sending blood, out to distances across the body, so to the lungs or to systemic circulation. So again, I tried to say this, but this puts it better. So the muscular nature of the ventricles allows for powerful contractions to be able to push that blood out of the heart and into the other parts of the body. And then there's also these structures called valves, which block off different parts of the heart from each other. So between the atria and ventricle on each side, there's these atrioventricular valves. On the right side, there's a tricuspid valve, and on the left side, there's a mitral valve. Sometimes the mitral valve is also called the bicuspid valve, but this is not, the Kaplan book mentioned that this is not really in usage in medical circled anymore, so I think you might see both, but mitral is the one that's going to be used more often. And then there's a question in the chat. Are there just two veins, superior and inferior vena cava, that bring deoxygenated blood into the right atrium? Yeah, so there's veins all across the body, and I think all of them, before blood enters back into the heart, feed into either the superior or inferior vena cava, and then what they do is bring deoxygenated blood back into the right atrium, and I think that's exactly correct. There's a slide coming up on that, so if I said that wrong, will correct me later, but okay, after the atrioventricular valve, then there's the semilunar valves, and these separate ventricles from the rest of the vasculature. So the pulmonary valve is one of these, and this separates the right ventricle from circulation. Specifically, it separates it from the pulmonary artery. On the other hand, the aortic valve is another one, and this separates the left ventricle from the aorta. Then another thing to mention is that the left side of the heart is much more muscular because, the B /W is just supposed to mean between. So, to go back to this, the left side of the heart is more muscular because the left ventricle pumps out blood to the rest of the body, whereas the right side pumps out blood only to the lungs. The lungs are pretty close to the heart, whereas other parts of the body, you need to, in some cases, you need to go as far as your peripheral organs, so like your feet, your hands, so that's very far from the heart. So that left hand side of the heart needs to generate more, much more force than the right hand side does to just get to the blood to the lungs. So to maintain that higher blood pressure and force, the left side of the heart is more muscular to provide that force. Here's kind of like a summary of like an image to summarize those structures. I'll take you through it just a bit quickly. So these are your atria. These are your ventricles. Your left side of the heart that contains the oxygenated blood, the right side that contains the deoxygenated blood. So your right ventricle pumps out blood through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs, whereas your left ventricle pumps out blood through your aorta to the rest of your body. And the valves that we talked about here is between your right atrium and right ventricle. That's your mitral valve. Yes. Oh, sorry. And then, no, I got that wrong. So right atrium and right ventricle is the tricuspid valve, and left atrium and left ventricle is the mitral valve. Okay. Obviously, these are hard to memorize, and it's been a while. So just spend your time really trying to get to know these structures. They show up pretty often, so well worth spending time on this. And then the other valves, the semilunar valves that separate the ventricles from the rest of the circulation. So here's your pulmonary valve that separates your right ventricle from your pulmonary artery. And then your left ventricle is separated from the aorta through the aortic valve. And I think that's most of it. And here's the inferior vena cava, I guess, and the superior vena cava here. These bring back deoxygenated blood to the right atrium, so that was correct. And then your aorta carries out blood to the rest of your body. I think that's mostly everything. Okay, so the next thing to discuss in the circulatory system is electric conduction in the heart. So the heart is notable for its rhythmic contraction that keeps it functioning. So this electric regular contraction of the heart is maintained by electrically excitable structures in the heart. And there's 4 of them: the sinoatrial node, the atrioventricular node, bundle of His, and Purkinje fibers. So what these structures do is that they coordinate ventricular contraction in regular time frames. And this is possible because there's these structures called intercalated disc that connect the cytoplasm of muscle cells, so they're able to communicate essentially to maintain that regular contraction. And let me show you the picture before I go back into the explanation. So the sinoatrial node is right up here tucked into the upper left-hand corner of the right atrium. And the atrioventricular node sits at the kind of like the meeting point of the meeting point of the right and left, atrium and right ventricle. And the Purkinje fibers and the bundle of His also sits fairly close to the atrioventricular node, and it branches off into these Purkinje fibers that carry away the electric signal to both ventricles. So to go back to this, contraction can occur without neurological input. So it's not dependent on the neurological signals, but that input can affect its rate of contraction. So what this is all to say that the circulatory system is under autonomic control. Okay, to take you through this pathway, the sinoatrial node generates the electrical impulse, so it's the thing that starts it and causes the atria to contract. And then the signal reaches the atrioventricular node, and it's kind of held there to allow the ventricles to fill up. Because when the atria contract, they're doing that to fill up the ventricles. So by holding this signal there at the atrioventricular node, you kind of wait for the ventricles to fill up. After that, ventricles are filled up with blood, the signal is carried down to the bundle of His and Purkinje fibers, which then distribute the signal to the ventricular muscles and allow them to contract at the necessary rhythm. So there's a question in the chat, what was the His bundle? So again, all of these four structures are just electrically excitable structures that maintain the rhythmic contraction of the heart. The His bundle is just one of these structures, and it just receives the electrical signal from the AV node and passes that on to the Purkinje fibers. The Purkinje fibers then carry this signal on to the ventricles to allow them to contract. Is that okay? All right, and then to talk about the contraction of the heart muscle in terms of blood pressure. So here I have systolic and diastolic blood pressure. I'm sure most of us know what this is. So when you talk about your blood pressures at the doctor's office, the systolic blood pressure is the number on top and the diastolic blood pressure is on the bottom. So your systolic blood pressure is the one that you measure when your ventricles are contracting and pushing out that blood either through your lungs or to the rest of your body. So systolic blood pressure, think ventricles are contracting to pump blood out. On the other hand, the diastolic blood pressure is when your ventricles are relaxed, but your atria are contracting to fill up the ventricles with blood to be pumped out. So in summary, systolic blood pressures, ventricles are contracting to pump blood out. Diastolic blood pressures, ventricles are relaxed and are being filled up with blood. And this slide says much of what I just said in more words. So systole, ventricular contraction, diastole, ventricular relaxation. So obviously systole has higher pressure to create enough force to pump blood out of the heart. And in systole, the atrioventricular valves are closed to prevent backflow of the blood back into the atria. And diastole has lower pressure because the ventricles relax. And in this part, the semilunar valves are closed because your atria are filling up the ventricles with blood. So you don't want to pump out any blood to either the aorta or the pulmonary artery. So question in the chat, what is blood pressure referring to? So blood pressure is referring to, well, blood pressure is the pressure that blood exerts against blood vessels.
No, my question is, when you're saying systole, you're just saying it's the ventricles constricting, but it's systolic pressure. So which pressure is it referring to? The ventricle pressure or the aortic, or sorry, the atrial pressure?
You can just know it in terms of the ventricles. I think it would get too confusing to kind of think about it in terms of both, but these are probably the simplest definition. Just know that systole is when your ventricles are contracting and their diastole is when your ventricles are relaxed. Is that okay, or does that not help?
That's fine. Thank you.
Okay, so your diastolic pressure, so this is when your ventricles are relaxed. This is maintained by the elasticity of the walls. So the ventricles have enough muscle in their walls, so these are muscular structures, and they can stretch to receive the blood from the atria. Otherwise, your blood pressure would crash right after the ventricles contract and couldn't fill up with blood. And then another thing to note is that this formula for cardiac output in terms of heart rate and stroke volume. So cardiac output is the volume of blood pumped out per minute. And you get this by multiplying heart rate, which is beats per minute. So just how many times does your heart contract in a minute, times the stroke volume. And stroke volume is the volume of blood pumped out per beat. And just know this formula, pretty easy, pretty straightforward, but it may come up. A lot of times it's given to you in a passage, but it's fairly easy to remember, so you might as well just know it. Okay, when you talk about, next we'll talk about the vasculature, and this is basically just referring to your blood vessels throughout your body. And there's 3 different main types: arteries, veins, capillaries. Arteries are the ones that carry blood away from the heart, and they branch into smaller arteries called arterioles. And these are highly muscular and elastic because these are the blood vessels carrying blood away from the heart. So they need to pump out with enough force to get the blood to significantly far distances away from the heart. And arteries mostly carry oxygenated blood because they're taking it to other parts of the body, except one exception is a pulmonary artery, because this is going to carry deoxygenated blood to the lungs, and then lungs will oxygenate it. On the other hand, veins are kind of the exact opposite of arteries. They carry blood towards the heart, branch into venules. They're thin-walled and inelastic, unlike arteries. So because of this, because they're because they don't have the muscle and kind of the elastic nature of arteries, they need valves, especially larger veins, to prevent backflow. And another reason for this is because veins are working against gravity. So a lot of the blood that's coming back to the heart, the majority of this is being carried up towards the heart against gravity. So that's also another important reason why veins need valves. So because they don't have this muscular nature and elastic walls, veins actually rely on skeletal muscle to propel that blood forward. Arteries, on the other hand, can just generate force with the large amount of muscles they have surrounding the vessel and to propel that blood forward, but veins actually need that skeletal muscles. Arteries do not. And arteries in the heart, the aortic valve is not in the aorta, it separates the left ventricle from the aorta. So arteries do not have valves. Welcome. And then last type of blood vessels is capillaries. So these branch from arterioles and venules. So these are really, really small blood vessels. And these are kind of like the functional unit of the cardiovascular system, circulatory system. And so they perfuse, which means they give oxygen to the tissues of the body. They only have a single endothelial cell layer, which means it's a thin wall, and this thin wall is important because gases, nutrients, waste, etc. can just diffuse across the thin wall. And then the question, is it just the systemic veins that have valves? I think, are you asking in terms of like systemic veins versus like smaller veins? Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't think the pulmonary vein has valves. And I think not all veins have valves either. Um, Let me just look it up really quick. Sorry. So yeah, pulmonary vein has no valves. It's because the lungs are just a short distance away, so there's not really a need um, to prevent that backflow between such a short distance. But you don't need to know such like detailed um, things about like each type of vein in terms of valves. And oh yeah, so don't get confused by the pulmonary valve. This again, like the aortic valve, it's not to prevent backflow within the vein itself. It's that you don't want to allow blood from the right ventricle to enter the pulmonary artery. So the valves in the veins are within the veins themselves, while the valves in the heart separate different structures of the heart. So I'm not sure what you mean by that they're switched, but the pulmonary veins still do take blood back to the heart, and the pulmonary arteries still do take blood away from the heart, but they're just different in terms of which. So they're different in terms of like veins are typically deoxygenated blood, but pulmonary veins bring back oxygenated blood. And arteries typically carry oxygenated blood, but pulmonary artery carries deoxygenated blood. But the direction is not switched, as Maithili, I hope I said your name right, says. So yeah, it's not switched in terms of bringing or taking away blood from the heart. Arteries always take blood away from the heart. Veins always bring blood back to the heart. Okay. Just wanted to clarify that. And here's kind of a cross-section picture of each blood vessels to give you a visual. So that artery has that really thick, like muscular layer. Excuse me. And the veins do not. And another thing I'll briefly mention is that you can see that arteries have like a small lumen, while veins have really large lumens. And this actually directly relates to how much blood is in veins versus arteries at a given time. So I think it's something like 3/4 of all blood in the body at a given time is located in the veins of the body. So most of the blood at a given time in your body is located in veins. And then you can see compared to the arteries and veins, the capillary is really thin, has a single layer of endothelial cells, and also very small lumen. So, and just a note I have here about what endothelial cells actually are. These are just cells that maintain the vessel they regulate, they're the actual function unit of also regulating vasoconstriction and vasodilation. And they also have a couple other functions, such as forming blood clots in the event of damage, and also allowing blood cells like white blood cells to pass through. What do you mean higher? Like faster? Like more forceful? Yeah, it's more forceful in the arteries because of the muscular nature and the force that they're able to generate. Okay, and then I have a question here. Rank the following blood vessels in orders of their average pressure. And that's a kind of a similar questions to what Andrea just asked. So like what's able to generate the most pressure and therefore the most force? All right, so I think everyone said B. So yeah, I won't talk about this too much because we have a bunch of slides to cover still, but yeah, so across the circulatory system, the resistance just kind of drops considerably. So the capillaries have low pressure, so you can allow for diffusion. And then but even from the capillaries, you have lower pressures in the veins and venules and then veins. Another question, which blood vessels carry deoxygenated blood away from the heart? So this is kind of that discussion that we were about to get into earlier. So arteries always carry blood away from the heart, but is that oxygenated blood or deoxygenated blood? Okay, I'm only seeing A's, and that's correct. So the coronary arteries, if you don't know what they are the arteries that actually just supply the heart itself. So it would need to have oxygenated blood. Pulmonary artery, on the other hand, carries blood away from the heart to the lungs so that it can exchange oxygen and be oxygenated. So that is deoxygenated blood. Okay, and then to go into this whole pathway of circulation, if you guys haven't tried to memorize this before, it hasn't come up in anything. I guess it can seem kind of intimidating, but kind of just looking at it a lot of times would allow you to get it down. I'm not going to go into this too much because it's basically just memorization, but I'll just take you through the pathway just once, and the numbers on the left indicate the right order of this. So I'll start off with the right atrium. So the blood starts, say, in the right atrium. It's going to go through the pulmonary valve, sorry, not the pulmonary valve, through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it's going to cross that pulmonary valve and go to the pulmonary artery. It's going to go to the lungs, get oxygenated, come back via the pulmonary vein, enter the left atrium, cross the mitral valve into the left ventricle, enter this aortic valve, go through the aorta, and pump out blood to all parts of the body. So come back from there, blood coming back from different parts of the body. Sorry, let me just finish this and I'll look at the question. So right now we're looking at, we're at the point where blood has reached all different parts of the body. So it's going to come back in to the inferior vena cava in some cases, to the superior vena cava in some cases, and all once that comes back into the vena cava, it's going to enter the back into the right atrium. So shouldn't 6 be before 5? Pulmonary valve, pulmonary vein. Ah, you're right. Okay, let me fix that right now so before I forget. No, oh, okay. I'm actually missing one. So remember the veins bring back it, so it should be pulmonary arteries, not veins before lungs. Is that okay now? Yeah, it's not pulmonary valve to the pulmonary vein to the lung. It's pulmonary valve, pulmonary artery to the lungs, back to the pulmonary veins. Sorry about that. Okay. Briefly talk about portal systems, and I guess these can sound complicated, but what this is that in most cases circulation just passes through one capillary bed, but in some cases it would need to pass through 2 capillary beds in series before returning to the heart. And there's nothing really in detail that you need to know about it, except I guess just to know what they are. And there's 3 ones you need to know: the hepatic portal system, the hypophyseal portal system, and the renal portal system. So you can kind of read through what the last 2 are. The hypophyseal portal system is in the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. The renal portal system is in the glomerulus, and then the vasa recta capillary system of like a nephron. But we'll look at one of those. So this is the hepatic portal system. So you have this arterial blood carrying blood to the gut, so stomach and small intestines, and it passes through a first capillary bed in the stomach and intestine. And then there's this portal vein that connects these 2 capillary systems, and then after that it enters a second capillary bed in the liver before it gets back to the vein. So in most scenarios, when you don't have a portal system, this will just be one capillary bed. So it'll go artery, arterial, capillary, back to the venular vein. So there won't be this one connecting vein, and there won't be 2 capillary beds. So that's what is unique about a portal system. So let me pause here before I move on. We have about 20, like 15 or 20 slides to complete. I'll let you guys kind of let me know if you want me to just do a part 2 of this next week, or if you just like me to finish now. It's been a lot of information. I'm okay either way, but okay. So most people are saying pick up on it a different week. So I will just do that. Sorry to those who voted for finishing now, but we'll always post a video of it after we're done anyway. So if you have any pressing questions, you can just email me so I can get to it faster. So we'll stop